lovely day. We've had snow for the past 3 days. Unprecedented levels of snow. People can't get out of their homes. Cars are exploding in the roads due to the snow. It's been pretty cool, I guess. How are you? I'm cold, I'll say that.
It's been lovely.
Yeah.
It's been lovely.
Hmm.
The kind of weather that makes you want to do nothing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm always surprised
Are we doing anything anyway?
Yeah. Good question. Ostensibly, we're doing something, but you never know. I'm always surprised by how quiet snow is. I don't know. I haven't been in snow in like years, so I don't know. I was stunned. I was like,
to
"Why is it
walk
making
in
noise?"
when it falls?
When it falls, yeah.
Ah.
I don't know if I'm expecting it
It's
to make
part
noise.
of the magic, is it not?
Yeah, no, it's magical. It's quite good. It's quite good.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of snow. Snow's cool.
Yeah, I was out in a blizzard yesterday.
Yeah.
And I was on a
Oof.
sort of on a bit of a hillside overlooking the town, so I sort of got to watch this like grey cloud sort of
Beautiful.
sweep in down the valley and engulf us.
I wouldn't mind more snow, honestly. Or
Yeah.
less rain, more snow. I think that'd be a good trade-off.
Yeah. The show's preferred form of precipitation.
yeah.
Snow.
Endorsing
We
snow.
endorse snow.
We'll create a tier list of all the forms of precipitation. Sleet at the bottom. I'll say that right now.
I don't feel like I encounter sleet very often.
Yeah, it's sleeted a couple times in the past few weeks. It's like in the mornings. It was pretty crummy. Yeah, it was all right.
So it's closer to rain than snow then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I usually think of sleet as a sort of like subcategory phenomena of snow.
Oh, of like sharp, icy.
Ooh, I'm not even sure it's wet, more watery than snow.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We can agree on that. Yeah. Anyway, towards the bottom. That's like D
It's,
tier.
okay. We can't agree on a definition, but
yeah,
we
but
can
it sucks.
agree.
But it sucks.
It's not good.
I went over to the allotment to go check on the broad beans, and they were underneath. I just took the cover off, and they were underneath like 1.5 feet of snow. So, haven't checked them. That was 2 days ago. I haven't checked them since. I recovered them.
I remember to put my pane of glass on them before it got super cold, but then it got covered in like 3 or 4 inches of snow, and then they've been without sunlight for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
I went and uncovered them yesterday, but then put it back on because last night it was, I don't know how cold it got, but it was meant to drop to like -6 or something.
Yeah.
And then I was my intention to go and take it off this morning, but I've forgotten.
Yep. Well, yeah.
So now.
I'm supposed to go over to the allotment. I was supposed to go over
remind me
yesterday.
at the end. I go and hopefully give the beans a dose of sunlight.
Yeah. Please comment on this
Sufficient
episode.
to save them.
Remind Dan. Save the beans. I think all my beans might be dead, quite frankly, but we'll see. I have hope held out. My potatoes are doing quite well chitting, although I did just speak with someone at the allotment and he said not to do that because it doesn't matter, so I don't know. Charles Dowding said to do it, though, so that's why I'm doing it.
But presumably you're supposed to do that at a time sufficiently close to when you're going to be able to plant them.
I think it's like months away, weeks to months away.
Okay.
I think it's like 4 to 6 weeks. So I'm just.
So they're not going to spend too long in this this phase of growth.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. I'm probably going to be moving soon, and it's going to be such a hassle moving individual potatoes. It's going to be like, God.
Are they not in an egg carton or something?
They are, but it's like you can't have to be careful. Can't put them in a box because you don't want to break the chits off. So it's like it's just going to kind of be a separate trip of me just carrying these potatoes.
Yeah. One trip for the potatoes. The first thing that gets moved in.
Exactly. Yeah. That's good. I mean,
they're going to have to go up to the allotment at some point anyway.
Yes.
So you're just making some of the journey.
True. Yeah, true. I'm slowly getting them closer to their new home. Did anything interesting at all happen in the world recently? I cannot think of a single thing other than the death and destruction, as mentioned in last episode, that's been following us all year, and indeed the year before that. One thing I've been wanting to mention is how weird it is that Trump's like just gone. It's very strange. Do you feel any kind of like part of your brain
Remorse,
is missing?
loss?
Not remorse, perhaps loss. It's just odd. It's just odd that like all it took was getting him off Twitter and now he's just fucking gone.
Some uncanny feeling.
Yeah, it's very odd.
Well, I wasn't like he didn't feature very prominently in my like existence beforehand.
Fair enough.
Although I saw a little piece of footage of his press secretary saying something.
His press secretary.
Yeah, or the White House press secretary.
Okay.
I assume the White House press secretary is the president's press secretary.
Wait, you mean Biden's or his?
Oh, Biden's.
Okay.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah. Biden's press secretary, the new one.
The new one.
I'm not sure what the old one looked like. Was it Haley all the way through?
Last I remember, it was Mitt Romney's daughter, so I don't know.
Oh, really? Okay.
I don't know. I've been paying attention for a while.
So long ago, given up.
It would be really funny if Biden bought back Sean Spicer.
I tell you what I was doing. I finally got around to watching some videos about the whole GameStop thing.
What'd you come away with?
I mean, I wasn't really any the wiser because it wasn't exactly intended. It was a semi-informative, semi-comedic rundown of the events. So
how much did you lose?
Understand the broader implications. I didn't realize it was a months and almost years long activity. I didn't realize it the peak of events took several days.
Did you lose any money, Dan?
To say. I did not buy any GameStop stock. But anyway, there was a little clip of whatever Joe Biden's press secretary
right.
in that video, and I was just a little bit like, oh, that's what I assume is going to be at least a semi-competent face.
Yeah.
For a, I don't know.
Semi-competent.
Yeah, I didn't want to say. I didn't want to give the administration the credence of being competent, semi or otherwise.
Yeah.
But more professional.
Sure.
I suppose.
Sure. Yeah.
In probably an equally infuriating way.
Sure.
If I cared to be infuriated, I might well be infuriated, but no, they don't care.
Yeah, I was trying to explain to someone the other day about how, like, even if you're happy about, like, good, now it's Biden, now it's Obama, it's not Bush, it's not Trump, it's like you're still, because I remember when I was quite a bit younger when Obama first came into office, but there, even, like, for me, I was, like, in middle school or high school or something, and there was, like, a feeling of like, oh God, thank God, now I won't be as angry all the time. But it's like, no, you're just as angry because now you're not directing it at Bush. Now you're not directing it at Trump. You're directing it to like these people that won't let them do their jobs. And it's the same anger. It's the exact same anger. It's just like, if anything, you knew where your anger could go under Trump when you're like a lib, because it's like, I hate Trump. But when you're a liberal and it's just like, oh God, now Joe Biden's president and my life's still going to suck.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, you don't know who to be angry at.
Yeah. I was just about to say now it's the Liberals and Democrats' turn to conspiracy theory.
Exactly.
But the entirety of the Trump administration was full of like
100%.
liberal and democratic conspiracy theory lunacy as well. So
did you see?
But maybe it can reach new heights. Who knows?
That'd be fun. That'd be fun. Did you see any of the GameStop stuff where I forget who it was? Someone on MSNBC or somebody. It might have been Anderson Cooper actually, whatever channel he's on. He said something like, he was like, we've heard that it might be Russia or Iran buying the GameStop stock to like screw these hedge fund managers. It's just like,
yeah, I mean,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I saw a clip. Jimmy Kimmel or one of the
Jimmy Kimmel
was saying something similar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just
right. Well, now we know where Jimmy Kimmel's fortune is invested.
Exactly. Goddamn Russians.
Or he well knows his ideological function in the apparatus, which is to defend
exactly, which is doing quite
the financial elites.
Russia. I wish I could just blame everything on Russia or Iran. Why not?
I mean, we could.
We could. Yeah, exactly. If we ever like go to record and like we like screw up and we don't hit the record button.
Yeah,
like,
if we ever lose an episode.
It was hacked.
Oh, sure. Putin.
Speaking of Putin, speaking of Eastern Europe, which is adjacent to Central Europe.
Which is adjacent to where we are in Western Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Where we're talking about this stuff that took place in Central Europe. We read some stuff about the German Revolution, the entirely successful and never ill thought about German Revolution, 1918, 1919, depending on where you want to kind of put it, 1917, 1918, 1919. It was called, I only wrote down an abbreviation, so I think it was called The Problems of the German Revolution by Reinhard Rürup. It's just a short little essay, and it's doing exactly that, right? It's not giving you a big history of the German Revolution. It's just saying about what the problems of it were, and it goes into a bit of the historiography of the revolution, right?
Yeah, it's a very partial and sweeping overview, and it engages in detail only in the places where it chooses to. I think it's I mean, it was published in 1968, so it's a little dated now.
Sure.
But only in the sense that
Yeah.
is history.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's fine.
You know what blew my mind is that when he was at the beginning, he basically said, I'm writing this because it's the 50th anniversary of the revolution. And I
Yeah,
was
we've
just
just
like,
gone through the.
whoa.
Yeah.
It's
We're
one
a
of
few
those.
years out from the hundredth.
Yeah, it's just crazy. It's just crazy to think of like the 60s, the late 60s as being 50 years away from like 1917, 1918.
Yeah.
That blew my mind.
Yeah.
I just, maybe because I can't do math or I can't count, but that was
Well,
just
no, but
crazy.
it's just about you. Like, well, I was just about to say your, but it's a collective thing, isn't it? Like, I have a similar experience putting the mid-century as close to, like, the Second World War as it was.
Sure.
Like, I think of the Second World War as being somewhere near the beginning of the 20th century, but like relative proximity to the middle of the
To
century.
the middle of the century. Sure.
So I don't know what it speaks to. It speaks to either the speed of events, the number of historical events, or our willingness to recast them in a new light. Or
I think that, education. It's kind of like, I mean, at least for American education, it's like, this is when it began for us, baby. This is when we started kicking ass and taking names. So, I mean, America was certainly at its peak post World War II for that decade or so. So yeah, maybe that has something to do with that. I just thought that was crazy.
Yeah.
It's just like, Jesus.
Speaking of correcting history and obscuring history,
Interesting.
and rewriting history. I mean, this essay was written at a time when there was a process of rediscovering German history going on.
Absolutely.
And so really, I think a lot of this essay is intended to add to, but also to collect together various pieces of research that have been happening, or bits of the history that have been being rediscovered, and sort of to collect them together.
And to correlate them and see how they relate. And...
Yeah. But there's a lot of things sort of missing, kind of thing, like the violence and the bloodiness of certain events sort of disappear.
Yeah, the Freikorps basically doesn't get mentioned at all.
Feature not at all. Any of the high-profile or mass killings.
Sure. Yeah, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, none of them
not
get mentioned.
at all.
Yeah.
Which is curious to some extent to me, because so much of the thrust of this is about the tragedy of events to some extent, and the complicity of the mainstream of and the right of the workers' movement and the ostensible sort of socialist movement in curtailing the possibility of any real radical advance coming from the revolution of 1918-1919, and the degree to which that failure allowed for the 20s to develop in the way that they did and result in the sort of like the counter revolution that was the counter revolution that was the sort of Nazi ascension to power. You'd have thought there'd be a lot of desire. There could be desire and space in this essay to really detail the complicity of the Social Democrats in some of the worst crimes of this period.
Absolutely. Munich doesn't get mentioned. None of the Soviets really get mentioned. Well, that's not true. Workers' councils do get mentioned, but he doesn't bring up what happened in Bavaria with the Soviet. He just kind of writes it off as like one sentence being like, and then some like, paramilitary groups took care of that.
Sure, yeah. And to some extent, I suppose the thesis is that so much of the old regime survived the revolution that none of the necessary positive advance that could have been made was made. Which is quite an interesting narrative, actually, isn't it? Because it's not about individuals or specific crimes.
Sure.
It's about the kind of like the large scale result of the events and how they did or didn't change German society or German political and social thinking, and they didn't change the operations of the state or the various arms of the state, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Or the amount of control that could be applied to various arms of the state. The essay doesn't go into great detail into the events of the 20s, and my knowledge of it is very much lacking. So
cut that out.
So this could be a narrative and a piece of history that we want to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the general idea, right, is that, well, I suppose to kind of explain it, maybe we should talk about the historiography of it a bit, about how people have viewed the revolution.
Sure.
Because it seems like the revolution, the reason that I kind of said maybe it started in 1917, maybe it started before that, is because, again, in any of these events, it's like, how do you pinpoint a beginning? So much of it was born out of this just anger of dealing with World War One.
Mm-hmm.
Germany obviously losing World War One. And when, what's his name, Rürup brings up the kind of like stab in the back myth that Hitler used to kind of say, this is why we lost World War One, and this is why all your lives suck so much. He basically says that defeat for the revolution was its impetus. It wasn't the other way around, right? It wasn't that they lost this war because of everybody kind of being like, we need to, I don't know. He's kind of like flipping the stab in the back myth on its head, because he says the revolution kind of begins with the defeat, or at least with claiming that, like, with the surrender and stuff like that, right? So when the revolution takes place, we have a bunch of social democrats basically who come to power, right? And there's like one or two transitional phases where it seems like everybody's demands of just getting rid of the nobility, getting rid of, the Kaiser, all this different stuff, getting rid of, a big point seems to be of just getting rid of the, military system of nobility in the military. That the Social Democrats kind of begin to give lip service to this kind of like, these revolutionary ideas floating around. But then eventually what they claimed was their transitional government to get to a more democratic society just winds up becoming the government, right? And so then, because they want to stay in power, they kind of have to not like go to war, although actually, yeah, kind of go to war with like the more radical elements within German society who wanted to keep things pushing, keep things moving. It's kind of like the typical case of like the revolution eating its children, except the children didn't get eaten because the children, like, kept running everything. It was like, in a lot of revolutions, you see like this kind of movement forward where like the people, whether it's like Jacobins or the Girondins in the French Revolution, wanting to be more like, okay, guys, we're done with the revolution now.
At any point in time, the sort of revolutionary crest of the wave gets sort of consumed as it goes over.
Yeah, exactly.
Comes along.
But here, it doesn't. It just seems like the Social Democrats are kind of able to stop the revolution and stop its movement left to a certain extent.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's a twofold thing or whether there's one primary cause, whether the Social Democrats were so much more organized and knew what they wanted to achieve in the way that the left didn't, or whether it was just the total lack of coordination from the revolutionary forces. I probably shouldn't even say left, because the discontent was very broad, but the sort of ideological commitment or the self-conceptualization of the revolution by the revolutionaries was not very coordinated. It was quite sort of amorphous. But yeah, what was it? Was it that the Social Democrats were so big-brained, or was it just that the revolutionary forces, which they ostensibly allied themselves with, but really only as a way to find themselves in the position to quash it at every possible turn, and to most effectively combat it? Was it that those forces were so weak?
I guess we should, too, maybe just say, like, obviously it wasn't just the Social Democrats. I mean, Rürup does make a point that it's like, so many of, like, the former nobility guys, the former kind of, like, higher-ups, the upper classes, partnering with the Social Democrats. So it wasn't just, like, these evil Social Democrats. They were evil Social Democrats. But it was also elements of the old faction who wanted to, civil service guys. He makes a point that, like, very briefly, he says that a lot of the people who wound up kind of becoming more of the like right-wing paramilitary groups that Hitler used, and even at the beginning, like the Freikorps people, they were all, or a lot of them were former military either officers or just people who identified themselves with the upper classes. Whether or not they were in the upper classes, they just kind of liked to be like, these kind of like conservative pricks who like identified with the way things used to be, the aristocracy and things like that. Maybe even with the Kaiser, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, he also makes a point that he adds this kind of typical idea, which you see in a lot of revolutions, of there being like multiple revolutions, right? So he says the first phase of the revolution brought the Social Democrats to power. They were like, sorry, Prince Max, we're not going to have you. We're not going to have the Kaiser. We're not going to have any of you chuds. but things are going to kind of still be the same as they are. We're going to keep a lot of the civil service and power. Look at us, guys. We did it. Parliamentary democracy. No more monarchy. No more stuff like that. Which is kind of funny because it's like, how much of that had to do with the revolution and how much of that had to do with like Wilson's 14 points, where he was like, in order for Germany to surrender, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And one of them was have a parliamentary like system. So it's like, I'm actually not too sure how much one had to do with the other, but and then I guess the second phase being typical of a lot of revolutions where the people who were put into power by the revolution want to stop everything. And you had the USP, which was the Independent Social Democrats, which split. Spartacus League, the Communist Party. And indeed, you just had the workers' councils that were set up during the first phase of the revolution, attempting to push the revolution further. And the Social Democrats, the main bulk of them, and the old Party of Order, I suppose, wanted to quash it. And they did quash it. And that's kind of where the revolution ends, which is pretty brutal. Mm-hmm. So I guess that kind of brings us into the the historiography of the revolution, how everybody viewed the revolution after that. Because you can't, if you're part of, the Social Democrats who put themselves in power, you can't just be like, the revolution was bad. It was all horrible. It was really bad, because it's like that the first phase of it put you into power. Mm-hmm. So they had to create this narrative of that first bit was good, and that's all it was. It was just this, the dream of 1848, baby. We finally did it. But also there was this element they added of, Bolshevism. That's what they defeated, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, throughout the 20s, the primary narrative seems to have been the only combatants were the Social Democrats.
The Liberals, yeah.
And the Liberals, I suppose, or parties you say of order, I suppose, or constitutional parties. Mm. I mean, parties in favour of... I mean, there was an extent to which the Social Democrats weren't acting constitutionally in some of their actions. Mm. But they clearly sought constitutional legitimacy
and order.
And also just to maintain order, kind of thing. Everything that they did was to maintain order. So the narrative were those forces cast against Bolsheviks, which I guess in the 20s it was very easy to cast all communists or left-wing forces as being Bolshevik.
Yeah. Indeed, not just the 20s.
Well, I mean, So this official narrative, or this prevalent narrative for that period, clearly excluded a huge number of forces and sort of cast the revolution as victorious to some extent, in that it was a defense of the liberal democratic achievements or the things that had been achieved, and saw only sort of villainous communists who sought to subvert it in whatever wildly and nefarious ways communists seeks to subvert things. And so much of what this new narrative was attempting to put back on the table was obviously a huge amount of the sort of the nuance, but if you're going to sort of choose another narrative structure for the new historiography that was being conducted basically in the mid 50s and into the 60s, was this rediscovery of the sort of radical possibility of the revolution, I suppose, or the possibility that it could have had a much more positive outcome than the one that was achieved.
Sure.
Because in the 20s, nobody was aware of what was going to become the events of the 30s that would lead into Nazism and the Second World War, right?
Sure.
And so the Social Democrats and the Weimar Republic in the 20s had sort of created this sort of triumphalist history, which to some extent almost erased the revolution in a lot of ways.
Sure.
And it's strange, I think, because to some extent this essay is attempting to put or to bring together all of the new histories which are attempting to put the revolution back on the table. But it kind of also ends with this sense of actually the revolution. I mean, it happened; it was a thing, but it almost might as well not have to some extent. But yeah. So the sort of the new history is to sort of recognise the revolution as happening. And also not to see the revolution as just something tragic, something which allowed for right-wing grievance to propagate itself through the 20s
Sure.
and feed into Nazism.
Feed into kind of the same narrative almost. There are kind of different elements, but I mean, like, the idea of, this clash with Bolshevism that the Social Democrats propagated is like so easy to see how that could be exploited by the right wing, right? The nationalist, ultra nationalist right wing, as it was. And I mean, Hitler would come along and use that same narrative and add the whole stab in the back narrative, which is like, goddamn, these communists caused us to lose the war. He would obviously add in Jews. He would add in like Polish people, basically like everyone who wasn't, from Bavaria, basically. But he definitely did use a like very similar line that the Social Democrats used, just to keep order, right? But then Hitler used it to basically, take power and to, have his own way. But it's funny, isn't it? Because I mean, like, obviously, we can see how that narrative was like exploited by Hitler and by the Nazis to foment like ultra-nationalist right-wing fervor in Germany. But I did like how Rürup kind of brought it back at the end to kind of say that like that narrative, other than the stab in the back narrative, like that narrative still kind of stayed the same in the context of West German historians studying the revolution during the Cold War. Because he basically says, right, that like they kind of had to reframe the revolution as a struggle against Bolshevism still, because like otherwise the kind of narrative of like, what could have been would have all kind of come crashing down. So they reframed it as the revolution was still a struggle with Bolshevism, but because those Bolsheviks, did what they did, that opened the door to Hitler. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like this narrative that's like kept, elements of it have kept the same throughout the Weimar Republic, throughout Nazi Germany, and even throughout Western Germany. And I mean, I would imagine even until now, I've never really like spoken with many Germans about like this revolution and what they get taught.
Sure, yeah, I guess it's everybody adapting. Well, I guess you take the existent narrative and you bend it to match your times, right? So like, in the 20s it was triumphalist, and we celebrate our victory and defeat of Bolshevism and defense of the new democratic republic, which is so glorious that we live in it and it'll last forever. There's an excellent Weimar constitution that we have.
We love it, folks.
Obviously, events took a turn, and after the Second World War, that narrative continued, but it lost its sort of triumphalist veneer and became about the tragedy of how the radical elements in the 1918-1919 revolution at least laid some of the seeds for what would become the Nazis' rise to power, based on how that fed into the Nazi narrative, basically.
I like phrasing the transition from Weimar Republic to Nazi Germany as events took a turn. Events indeed took a turn. But yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because I mean, in the kind of like latter stages of the French Revolution, you see this back and forth with like the people in power trying to like smack down left-wing uprisings, and then at the same time, when that leaves room for the right wing, they smack down the right wing, and then the left wing comes back up, and then they smack down the left wing again, and then you get Napoleon. But it's funny because in the German Revolution, you see they smack down the left and then just don't think about the right at all. They're like, but what about if we let like Hindenburg just stick around? What's the worst that could happen? I mean, it's interesting too, isn't it? Because Rürup basically just says that like the civil service remained exactly the same. All of the social relations were exactly the same as they were prior. It was just like, okay, you don't have the Kaiser and you don't have Prince Max taking his place.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There was a ludicrous quote, and I've not written down who it was that it was actually quoting. I've just written down the quote. But a contemporary, so someone in the 20s, said that this revolution differs essentially from all earlier revolutions in having broken up and eliminated every institution of the power of the overthrown class.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Pretty brutal.
Nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Than that statement.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny.
And so much of the narrative of this essay is the new revolutionary, in air quotes, government's total failure to both dismantle and oppose any of the power structures of the old regime, but also to not recognize that there could be any threat of counter-revolution from the right at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Or maybe like their hands were tied, right? Because it's like they needed the right to stay in power.
sure,
So,
yeah. I guess you can. Okay. So we can spin the narrative that's favorable to the Social Democrats to some
Sure.
extent.
Sure.
I guess the Social Democrats. I mean, the Social Democrats kind of become the villains of this piece to some extent, in the sense that they manipulate the revolution, but also manipulate the revolutionary forces, the other revolutionary forces, I suppose, to achieve all their own ends and achieve none of the ends of anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
one could cast the people they manipulated as foolish for letting themselves be manipulated in the way that they are.
Mm.
One can berate them, all these other forces, for being poorly organized, poorly disciplined, poorly prepared, all of which was the case. But so the Social Democrats are feature very prominently in the narrative. Obviously, the German Social Democrats come from a revolutionary tradition. At this time, still claiming and deploying socialist, but also avowedly Marxist rhetoric and pieces of phraseology and terminology. But I mean, I guess they'd always contained right and left wing elements, more radical and revolutionary elements, and more sort of evolutionary.
Big tent.
Big, it was a very big tent. But given the Social Democrats, in some cases support, in other cases sort of like complicity by inaction.
Sure.
In supporting Germany's involvement in the First World War, and that those choices and those events precipitated various splits in the party. The right wing kept control of the Social Democrats, and the independent Social Democrats, the more left wing element, split. And then there was a subsequent split in that faction. The Spartacist League went away, and in 1919 formed the Communist Party. So a lot of the left had vacated in various fashions the Social Democrats, and the Social Democrats had become more evolutionary in their outlook, less revolutionary, much more willing to be a party in support of constitutionalism and order. I guess if you wanted to put a very positive spin on their outlook, you might have said, well, they really wanted to just sort of get through this process of getting out of the First World War, and their internal belief, or at least the internal belief of many of the people involved, was that they would be able to institute and instantiate more sweeping reform of Germany once they got through this sort of like transition into the new regime that was going to be,
and whatever that was going to be.
Yeah.
It wasn't really going to be communism.
Yeah, and I think to a large extent they had been for a long time a democratic party, and I think they'd been preparing themselves for taking over the German state and developing it towards something more socialist inspired, socialist, in a very gradualist way.
Sure.
And so it's not a surprise that they, for the most part, weren't desperately keen to institute some kind of more radical overthrow of the previous order. And then there is also the context in these in which these events were happening. One of the things that they really wanted to avoid was Allied invasion of Germany. And if civil war in some form had have broken out, if events had taken a avowedly more radical and revolutionary turn, I think it's highly likely, or implied that it's highly likely, that would have happened. Whether or not that would have, from an objective standpoint of the development of history in ways favourable to different forces, how that invasion would have played out, who can say?
Yeah.
Obviously, it would have been terrible for the people involved who would
Wouldn't
have
have been good.
would have been involved in the fighting or what have you.
Mm.
But clearly, the Social Democrats, as a party of order, as a party of constitutional order, wanted to maintain for the most part the territorial integrity of Germany and sort of like
Yeah.
transition to peacetime in the fastest way possible.
Yeah. Which, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, yeah, they'd been at the worst war up until that point for 4 years.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's also like, I mean, the obvious criticism is like, what do you think's going to happen when you partner with the right wing?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, indeed, that is what happened. It's interesting. He brings up a couple points that I find really kind of interesting in that context, where he says that like a lot of the mutinies that kind of, you know, where historians go, this is where the revolution began, right? Army mutinies and stuff weren't really, it didn't seem like he was implying, correct me if I'm wrong, but he didn't seem like he was really implying that those were like began by or inspired by any kind of like Marxist or communist left-wing thought. A lot of it was just like getting rid of the officer corps and, you know, trying to make things palatable during, you know, this post-war period. And it's interesting because it seems like even a lot of the workers' councils and stuff like that were set up, and a lot of the demonstrations even, I mean, they just seemed so like nobody was really steering the ship. Like it was just this anger. Like everybody was angry and they knew what they were angry about, but they couldn't really do anything about it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, like maybe that's, I'd have to read a bit more, but like maybe that's why Rosa Luxemburg was famously like, oh boy, the Spartacus uprising, like this is a little premature. We're kind of jumping the gun here. She wound up kind of being right about that, obviously. But it was interesting. I mean, also the kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy he talked about a bit later of the more democratically minded officers in the officer corps not being able to get anything done because the Social Democrats were just dragging their feet with changing anything. So they all just resigned. So you're just left with this ultra right-wing corps of, you know, officers in the army. Yeah, it's all very interesting. I mean, yeah, I don't know what more there is to say about it other than just like there needs to be somebody steering the ship for all of this stuff. And I mean, there was this bottled up anger. And I just feel like you see so much of that now, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That you can kind of compare with like, everybody's pissed off, you know, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, everybody's pissed off. We all knew exactly what we were pissed off about. But it's like, what can you do? There's just this anger.
Yeah. Yeah, what is made very evident in this essay and what's clearly brimming over and boiling over was this huge amount of anger and resentment in so many parties. From so many places, in a way that I almost couldn't understand. But it really seemed like there was this huge desire for like really sweeping change, born out of a really great resentment and frustration. And it kind of felt it really is implied that kind of like no quarter would have been immune from this transformation if it was allowed to play out. Kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Or at least like that resentment and anger was directed at a great many places, not just sort of like from the army against the military. But the degree to which, like the way in which the civil service is cast in this so much really struck me as something that was like hard for me to conceptualize and wrap my head around, kind of thing. Now maybe I don't really understand how the civil service of a sort of like of the
state.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out what how to characterize the German regime before 1918.
Yeah.
I know the German Empire, I suppose. Yeah. How the civil service functioned and how fully it may have like it serviced the interests of a particular class and then elite and the state in a way that was visually or clearly open to a huge amount of resentment from the population more broadly. I
mean, it's interesting. I think it's pretty comparable, right, to like the guys in the army who identified more with the upper classes and who identified more with like maybe they got tossed a bone by like I don't know whatever the word would be, like some duke. It's not a duke, but it's like some guy who was just appointed to be a commanding officer in the army. And so maybe they felt like, oh wow, you know, one day that could be me, something like that. It seems like you can draw parallels maybe with the civil service. Yeah, it's a bummer. I mean, he really makes the point that the Social Democrats in the first phase of the revolution really only stunned the old power system, and that nothing else was really born out of that. So it's like when the Social Democrats put down the rest of the revolution, the second phase, they're like, oh, okay, I guess we'll just get back to the way things were. Nothing really changed, at least not for that long,
Sure.
as it changed at all, I suppose. I did like at one point how he said that he was talking about how spontaneous the revolution was, just born out of this anger, or at least the rebellions at the beginning. He said that indeed, if revolutions are made by reactionaries and not by revolutionaries, as Babel is supposed to have said, the German Revolution is a classical case.
I
Yeah,
interpreted reactionaries there as like people just reacting to circumstances
exactly.
rather than in a kind of like right wing
Yeah.
pejorative sense.
Yeah,
assume,
exactly.
Anyway,
I mean, it is funny. It's exactly what you're saying. It's like, how can I think I have a hard time wrapping my head around how there could be that much anger and everything seemingly like just kind of going the path of least resistance. Although I guess saying that out loud, I guess that makes sense. But it's like, I don't know. It just seems like there needed to be a radical transformation. There needed to be something. But instead, the civil service, the military, it all kind of got kept how it was.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, as you say, I mean, like maybe it's that the revolutionary forces were lacking in any type of leadership, which was going to sort of channel that anger to them. Or maybe not a leadership, but like there weren't any organised parties in the way that would have been necessary to channel that anger. And the forces of order were too well organised compared to somewhere like Russia, where like the Tsarist regime was, and the sort of regime that succeeded it were like just like grossly incompetent.
Yeah.
I don't know to what extent. I'm almost inclined to wonder whether like more stock should be put in the incompetence of that regime than the overall competence of the forces, the revolutionary forces in Russia. Not that they weren't clearly more organised in that they could like mount as more successful challenge to the to the regime and to the state when it was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, how worrying is that? I mean, it's like Stafford Beer said when Eden Medina was kind of quoting him and saying like he read everything that Marx said. And he did that little diagram of the like writing the class struggle as a little diagram, cybernetic diagram, and he was like the forces of order organized, the revolutionary forces, the working classes not organized. Done. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I was very stressed out reading this because you get the feeling that now, even if a lot of people want to pretend that like, oh God, the beginning of the end of the American Empire, it's like, as true as that may be, it's like, at least the revolutionary potential in the United States is like null right now if you take this as like any kind of guidance, because, as crazy as Trump was, as like much of a buffoon as buffoonery was going on in his administration, it's like local police forces, federal repressive apparatuses, still as organized as ever, honestly. And it's extremely stressful reading something like this where you just go, even if we were to get to the point where there was some sort of revolutionary potential, you just go, oh God, how organized would you need to be to overcome that? And it seems just like, I don't even want to think about that. It seems like the answer would just be too depressing. You know what I mean?
But it's interesting. I don't know. Yeah, it's true. But how I assume what you mean is how far would it take to get somewhere like the United States or Britain even to the point where Germany was at this time?
Yeah.
Because the impression I get anyway from this essay is that the situation was there to be exploited, kind of thing.
Sure.
And it was a failure to marshal those forces. When I say that the Social Democrats seemingly manipulated the revolution and the other revolutionary forces, there are lots of ways in which the Social Democrats had to play lip service to the revolution, predicated on, I guess, on a belief from their part that these forces were incredibly powerful.
Sure.
The network of workers and soldiers councils was enormous and clearly wield at least a huge amount of potential power if it were willing to be deployed. There's a point in which the Social Democrats effectively have to say that, well, basically cede, at least rhetorically, all sort of formal power to the councils, but obviously that the power was never wielded in a way that was that had any direction, because, as you say, one, they didn't have any particularly effective leadership, but their desires weren't unified into any particular program. They were using language borrowed from the socialist and from the workers' movement, because either because it best matched what was actually happening, or because it was basically what was available to them at the time.
Yeah.
But their rhetorical demands were, their actual demands were much more democratic and not particularly socialist. They just wanted to advance democracy into more fields than it seemed like it was going to advance, as we say, into the military, into the civil service, and other fields as well. And seemed very clear, like, compared to somewhere like Russia, where there was this back and forth between the Soviets and the provisional government, both claiming various powers and responsibilities, and although there were sort of like various ententes between the two of them, and they did come to various arrangements, like the Soviets were willing to claim and attempt to wield power.
Sure.
Or at least to have influences in the spaces which they wielded influence, kind of thing. Although this is a short essay, and we should read a much more detailed study of the sort of like the German council movement.
It's very
period of
dismissive
time.
of the councils.
Yeah, the narrative that you get is that there really wasn't any willingness to, at least at this time in the winter of 1918, there really wasn't any willingness to deploy that power. And the way that he describes it was that they were basically, compared to Russia, they were unwilling to pose the council structure as a new model for a state structure or an organisation of government. There was no willingness to have it be a model.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a network that had fashioned itself, but it wasn't seen for its radical potential, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now, later on in 1919, when there is this second wave of revolution, when it becomes apparent that the desires and the demands of the initial wave really weren't going to be met, when sort of left-wing forces became more organised, there was this switch to a sort of like a much more rhetorical commitment to councilism. The terminology of the councils became something attached to left-wing ideology, left-wing political theory. But by that point in time, the actual existing council movement had been so thoroughly sort of like either sidelined or quashed that that possibility didn't exist anymore.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if this was just by virtue of the reality of the events that took place, or by Rürup's kind of view of the revolution. But I had always had this view of like, it was this close in Germany, like it was this close. We were almost there. We almost had, like a socialist government, an actually existing socialist government put into place. And then, you just go off on the alternate histories from there, right? It's what if there were two communist countries in Europe, blah, 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 blah. Reading this, though, it really made it apparent that it was not that close at all. It didn't really seem like communists were almost in power. I don't know. A lot of those narratives were kind of changed. Even just the narrative of like the Freikorps, as much as he talks about it, as being like, I feel like now you kind of think about the people that Hitler used to eventually kind of take power as being like people, and like working class people, and of the people. But it's like in this, you kind of get the feeling that it's like, no, they weren't. They were like kind of like at least something resembling middle class or above, or people who had like had their ideologies twisted by those people. So yeah, I don't know. This essay did kind of change a lot of those narratives in my head for me, and we should definitely read more about this revolution that isn't 27 pages. But I think the main thing that I took away from this was depression, because you don't see, it doesn't come across that the revolution was that close to happening. Although it's funny because I didn't know much about the councils. I didn't know much about that, and I think that that's kind of like stunning that even managed to take place. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's another piece of this that's not particularly well worked out.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, maybe we were intended to have more familiarity with the history on reading this essay, kind of thing.
Mm.
But it's kind of coming back again to like our shock at the degree of resentment there was,
Yeah.
and where it was willing to, where that resentment was directed, or how far-reaching people were willing to direct that resentment, and that revolutionary sort of desire. It's also, yeah, quite shocking that such a sort of large network of organisation could sort of like spontaneously collect itself together.
Yeah,
Kind
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
it's one of the things that has always inspired a lot of people who engage with sort of left wing theory, kind of thing, is the degree to which collective organisations of the working class, such as councils or Soviets, which are basically the same thing, do seem to generate themselves with a degree of spontaneity, kind of thing.
Yeah.
People do come together to consider and defend their sort of collective interest, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely hope in that. I mean, because even though Rürup does make the point that it's like these, a lot of this spontaneous action, especially in the military, wasn't being directed by like anything other than reaction to events. Yeah, no, there's definitely hope in that, right? I mean, people, at least some people, at some points, have figured out what's best for everybody, and including themselves, and tried to act on that. There's an Adam Curtis documentary. It's 3 parts. I forget what it's called. It's like Ghosts of the Past or something like that. But the first part, he talks all about Germany attempting to come to terms with itself post World War II, and that generation coming into conflict with the Baader-Meinhof Red Army faction generation that were like their children. And it's so interesting. Like he interviews a lot of that generation, the children generation, who are like by the time he's making this movie like all grown up, right? But he talks to them about them confronting their parents and being like, so what did you do in World War II? What were you like? Were you a Nazi? Because we've never talked about this before. And their parents just having a complete like, we're never going to talk about this ever again. But it's interesting because as the movie goes on, Rürup finds that generation and he's able to talk with them, and they're like, we're not fucking want to talk about this at all. We're not gonna go into this at all, because these are like people who presumably like were eventually lived in West Berlin and kind of had more of a Western outlook on things. But as he speaks to them more, they go, oh, do you want me to play the like song that we used to play in like Hitler Youth on the piano for you? And they like start to get it out and they start to sing and they start to do all this stuff. And it's this crazy psychological twist of like this repression coming out. And I don't know. It's very crazy. It's now that we have this story where we can kind of bookend it with the beginning of World War I all the way to the like Red Army faction era. It's just crazy the way these different generations had to deal with the trauma that they had. And I mean, to bring it back to this essay, I mean, that's perfectly embodied in this warping of ideology that the different states had to do to say that the revolution as it existed, even if they were admitting that it did exist, was bad. You know what I mean? Just how you have to break your mind to make that happen, right? History.
Yeah.
Can't trust it. You do have to realize that things don't just happen in a void and that they're all connected. It's fascinating. Good stuff.
From the education about these events that I received, the idea that it was defeat in World War One and resentment about that, and resentment about how Germany was treated by the victorious powers in World War One, that fed into support for Nazism and the eventual outbreak of World War Two.
That's just what Hitler said. That was his excuse.
What escapes notice quite often is the failure of this revolution and its connection to the eventual rise of Nazism, kind of thing. Like the proximity that Germany got to real radical social, political, and economic change was quite close, and I think it left quite a scar that was clearly very apparent through the 20s and led into future events, kind of thing.
Yeah. Are bourgeois societies more Is it easier for them to palate fascism or communism? You be the judge, folks. You be the judge. But you're right. It's funny because like that narrative that we're left with about it's just resentment with how they were treated in World War I that led to everybody's being so mad. That's like that's basically the stab in the back, man. That's like a hop, skip, and a jump away from what Hitler said his excuse was.
Yeah.
Fools. It's it's absolutely maddening. And it is just because they had this brush with left-wing ideology, this brush with actual, real monumentous social change that they're just not willing to come to terms with. And we're still not. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how the German education system works, but I doubt they're like, guys, we almost did it.
No, I would imagine not. Yeah, I don't know who it was that said that behind every revolution, behind every fascism, there's a failed revolution. Might have been Benjamin, but I think he's clearly talking about this instance.
Yeah, no kidding. Bummer. Definitely seems like the revolution that has the most pertinence to our times, though, that we've spoken about so far. I mean, obviously, you can find much more recent ones, but this just seems like, oh boy, how brutal! What a bummer. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it's good to keep talking about it for that reason, if for no other reason than to keep talking about like the people who literally like gave their lives to try and make this happen. I mean, I was looking up different photos of like Berlin at the time of the revolution and the Spartacus uprising and stuff, and it's crazy because you just see photos of like the Spartacus League, people hiding behind like books with like machine guns, being like, it's like 9 people, and they're like, well, we're about to die, but like, that's insane. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah,
I cannot imagine a situation where I would like, I just can't imagine putting myself in that situation. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Where you basically know you're gonna die, but you're fighting for something that's so like, guys, we need to do this, otherwise it's all going to go to hell. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm impressed
Yeah.
with them, I'll say
Fair
that.
enough. It made me think a lot about something that I've heard Mike Monero talk about constitutionalism and whether you're going to be or set yourself up as being against the constitution of the state in which you live. And the proximity to constitutional order that various actors put themselves in this made that question to me quite a live thing, like because the Social Democrats clearly like they've presented themselves into some ways being anti-constitutional, right? They were willing to rhetorically draw their legitimacy from the workers' movement.
Well, I suppose that's also because that's how they kind of took power, was by a like breaking of what the Constitution as it existed for a brief period.
Yeah, but it was exactly. But it was all with the intention of like restoring constitutional order to some extent.
Sure, yeah.
It just made that feel like a much more sort of like opened up a lot of the sort of grey space between the black and white of being
absolutely
constitutional or not kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember hearing an interview with him at one point where he was saying that he was in the Labour Party, but then you realize like I'm actively saying like we need to overthrow the state. So he's like, I basically just gave them $20 to kick me out. Like, yeah, I mean, if you take that logic, I definitely see what you're saying about like the gray zone, but it's like if you are setting yourself up with the political aim of overthrowing the state, it seems logically it would follow that that entryism won't work, but I'm not going crazy because it's like, why would anyone want you in their party? You know?
There's something I've been thinking about a little bit. Like, if you're going to set yourself up as anti-constitutional to some extent, like, what would that actually look like?
Yeah.
Because, like, I mean, obviously, McNair has said, and it's evidently the case that there are right-wing forces operating in Britain which are anti-constitutional, and I don't mean like avowed Nazis. Sure. I mean Nazis. I mean like the extent to which, say,
the Brexit
movement opposed itself to cast the legitimacy of Parliament as being in question, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Cast the legitimacy of various rulings of the judiciary as being invalid based on like
populist lines.
Yeah, based on sort of populist belief. When you cast those kind of actions as being like appearing to be anti-systemic kind of thing. Like, to me anyway, it sort of opens up this space for what would sort of what would seemingly anti-constitutional, anti-systemic, anti-state to some extent demands look like that didn't seem like mad and totally out of place and like from 100 years ago kind of thing. Which so many sort of like communist and socialist demands read as.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to set that up as a question for now, but like.
Well, no, I think it's interesting, right? Because maybe the right wing has settled on a good medium where it's like you're not just saying get rid of everything all at once, institute communism now. It's more of like they pick on specific things to make their greater point. The state
and I guess what they've also done is built up a counter authority, right?
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
I mean, so much all of that stuff is cast in the guise of the sort of like the legitimacy of a Brexit that came from the referendum was a sort of populist legitimacy that trumped all other forces to some extent. So I guess you need to build up counter power, but also counter narrative and some place from which to draw a counter legitimacy, I suppose, or
hopefully from the people.
Sure.
But it's I see what you're saying. Where would that come from?
Yeah. And what would it sound like talking to normies? Where in a conversation that you were having with a normal person, from where could you draw a legitimacy which would feel
not crazy,
plausible, or justified,
sure. Yeah. Well, it's funny, right? Because that's there. I mean, it's all around us. But it's like what you're saying. Yeah, it's like how do you get that across to people?
And I guess it's a question of reconstructing a kind of like class-based narrative which doesn't shy away from the exploitation that's all around us, and
sure,
we should set our sights against kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me thinking about the things that could have been exploited recently. I mean, obviously, you did see some anti-state activity that never would have existed 10, 15 years ago in the wake of George Floyd and everything with, people talking about, why do we need a bloated police department like this?
Sure,
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just about
I mean, calling into question, pointing to the American and also the British states' inherent systemic racism is certainly a pointed attack at the constitutional nature of the state in and of itself, kind of thing.
One that the parties of order are definitely afraid of. Because, I mean, if you look at how they just, everything happened with the Black Panthers, with Fred Hampton, everything, where they were just like, okay, we need to end this by force.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. But Democrats were very willing to draw on a rhetorical sort of like commitment to defunding or in some ways disempowering the police.
Wait a minute, you're telling me that you didn't have a tear in your eye when Nancy Pelosi took a knee? Wow, Dan. Oh my God. Wow.
Just a softy, Jack, man.
Just a goddamn softy. It's funny, because you do need to take it a step further, and you need to tell people you can't be hypnotized by what they're trying to do. They're still your enemies. You can't say abolish the police and then go effing vote for, Nancy Pelosi or something like that.
Kamala Harris.
Exactly, literally. Who everybody loves. Speaking of legitimacy, if somehow, if she runs next time and wins, or I'm sorry, if she runs next time and Joe Biden doesn't run for a second term, who's going to care? I know that this is like a tired point, but it really hit me the other day where it's like, nobody really liked Kamala in the primaries. I don't know. That's like a very tired point at this point, but it's like,
sure.
Talk about bending over backwards.
I mean, there have been former vice presidents who've run.
Oh, sure.
And not gained a nomination, right? I mean, I suppose they've won and lost.
Yeah.
Do they frequently win nominations? But that can't be the case that they always win nominations.
Who would that have been if they didn't win the nomination? I feel like that might have happened. Did it happen under? I don't know.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell you. Look it up.
I'm trying to even think of people's vice presidents.
I mean, Ford obviously got it. George W. Bush got it.
Was Biden in the primary at any point in 2016, or was it always?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Because I think that was right after his son died, or during his son's death. I'm not sure, but I don't think he was ever in the primaries. That could be completely wrong. I don't know. But I don't remember that.
Yeah. How many presidents have been former vice presidents? It's a lot more than you'd think.
Probably a lot.
A lot. Yeah.
Bush, the first. Ford.
Was Reagan
others.
vice president for a while?
No.
Okay.
Don't think so, no. This is where I get scared talking about this on the show.
Was, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, because that's like, oh boy, I'm going to get this wrong. John Adams. Germany. What could have been? Bummer. Anything else to add, I suppose, about the German Revolution? We'll definitely be coming back to this because this is obviously like a pivotal moment in world history. One might say where the world failed to turn. The turning point where the world failed to turn. But
yeah, I feel very tantalized or enticed.
Oh!
Or
dang, keep going.
So much from this narrative, so much of what is lacking from this narrative is like on the ground sort of social history.
Yeah.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Let me just read the last paragraph just because why not? It's been a while. It basically just says the Weimar democracy embodied a principle that was basically anti-revolutionary, concerned with the establishment of order and opposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Only the short-sighted could feel a sense of triumph and believe that the objectives of 1848 had been achieved. No, everything that in 1848 had been a bold enterprise of progress turned now into an instrument of conservative slowdown employed to overpower the revolution and to provide its opponents with the opportunity for illegal activity and growing influence. Germany had a victorious revolution. It had the chance of democratizing itself thoroughly. It failed to make use of this chance. Sick. That basically says it all. Bummer. We should read some Rosa Luxemburg soon. I find her a very interesting kind of like historical figure. I like her relationship with Karl Liebknecht and everything. I think is kind of interesting, obviously. But yeah, I read, in doing like a little bit of background research for this episode, I just read the like anecdote about her. She'd been in prison for 2 years up until the revolution, right? And then as soon as she left, there was like a crowd waiting for her, and she like gave a speech, and everybody cheered. It's like, that's so fucking cool, dude. That rocks. So when Dan and I get imprisoned for doing this podcast, we better have at least 50 of me waiting outside. It'll be like Meowgrith, and that'll be about it.
Very hungry.
All right. Well, yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I suppose we should introduce the show. I'm Jack.
Dan.
This has been Auxiliary Statements. Before we go, we should mention that we have begun a capital reading series. So if you didn't see that in your feed, go back and look. Should be there. We read the first 6 pages. Probably got some stuff wrong. We did get some stuff wrong. Who cares? We're still reading the book. And should we say that we might have one out on Tuesday? Should we just say
We can say that we might.
We might have one out on Tuesday. So look out for that. That's going to be a new thing. And yes, anything else? Is there any other updates? I don't think so. Capital reading sessions. Good. Capital. Good one. Very exciting. The tension builds. All right. This is Auxiliary Statements. Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. This is good listening. And see you next time. The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.